It started as a normal night in our quiet little neighborhood. The kind of evening where everyone was winding down from their day, pulling their kids away from their screens, and getting ready for bed. But the phone call shattered that tranquility. I was sitting in the living room, my favorite cozy sweater wrapped around me as I sipped on some warm tea. The kids were tucked in their beds upstairs, and my husband Greg was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was some peace and quiet. That was when the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, unknown number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hello?" I answered, my voice soft and tired. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then a voice, calm, almost amused, spoke. "Nice sweater. It's a little chilly tonight, isn't it?" I froze. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. No one I knew would call me at this hour. The voice seemed almost too casual, like it had been studying me. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to hide the nervousness creeping into my voice. The voice chuckled softly. "You know exactly who I am. You're sitting in your living room right now, aren't you? You've got your tea in your hand, and your legs are tucked up underneath you. Comfortable, aren't you?" I felt my blood run cold. How could they know that? How could anyone know what I was doing at this very moment? My heart started to race. "I don't know who you are, but you need to stop calling," I said, my voice shaky but firm. The voice paused again, as if considering my words. Then it spoke with an eerie calmness. "You should go check on your kids. I know what they're doing right now." Before I could respond, the call ended. I stood there, the phone still pressed against my ear, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. The voice was too familiar with my life. My hands shook as I set the phone down and rushed upstairs to check on the kids. When I pushed open their bedroom door, I found them both sound asleep, just as I had left them. But the feeling of unease lingered. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak of the house made me jump, and every sound of a car passing by outside had me peering out the window. The phone calls didn't stop. Each time, they came at different hours, each more chilling than the last. The next morning, Greg noticed my exhaustion and asked what was going on. I explained what had happened, but he didn't seem to take it seriously. He chalked it up to a prank or a wrong number. But that night, the calls came again. This time, the voice sounded different, colder. "Your son is wearing his blue pajamas, right? I bet he's tossing and turning in his bed as we speak. It must be hard to sleep with that kind of knowledge, huh?" I felt my stomach churn. How could they know that? The worst part wasn't the fact that they knew about my son's pajamas, but the fact that I could hear a faint echo of my son's restless tossing in the background. It was as if they were right there, watching us. I tried to block the number, but every time I did, a new one would appear on the caller ID. The pattern was always the same. The calls would come in the dead of night, and the voice would say something so intimate, so specific, that it left me paralyzed with fear. "Your husband is sitting at the kitchen table right now, reading the paper. He's wearing that blue plaid shirt you like," the voice would say. Funny, isn't it? How someone can know so much about you without ever meeting you? It became clear that this wasn't just some random stranger. This person knew everything. What we wore, what we did, what we ate, even the smallest details about our daily lives. The calls didn't stop. They only grew more frequent and disturbing. Each day brought new signs that we were being watched, and no matter how much I tried to reassure myself that it was just a prank, my anxiety grew to an unbearable level. One night, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the living room, my nerves shot. Greg had gone out for groceries, and I was alone. I had become hyper-aware of every sound in the house, every shift in the shadows. Then I saw it. A face, pressed against the living room window. I jumped up, my breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered in my chest as I rushed to the window and flung the curtains open. But there was nothing there. No one. No sign of anyone outside. I stood there, staring out into the darkness, trying to calm my racing pulse. I wanted to scream, to call Greg and tell him to come home, but I didn't. I couldn't. As I stepped back from the window, my phone rang again. I froze. The familiar, unknown number flashed across the screen. Hesitantly, I answered. The voice, smooth and cold, came through the line. "Did you like the view? You looked beautiful standing there, staring into the night. It's almost like you knew I was watching. I could feel my knees weaken as my stomach churned. This was no longer just a phone call. This was a threat. Whoever was behind this knew where I lived, knew when I was alone, and knew exactly how to manipulate my every fear. The phone calls became more frequent and more personal. The voice would comment on things I hadn't even realized they knew. They knew the exact time I had dropped the kids off at school. They knew when I had walked into the grocery store. They even knew that Greg had been running late the other morning, mentioning his dark blue sneakers. I began to lose track of time. The calls came day after day, each more disturbing than the last. I felt like I was being driven to the edge of insanity. One evening, Greg and I were sitting in the living room together, discussing the latest incident. He'd started to take it more seriously after I showed him the phone records, each call marked by the same unknown number that had now become all too familiar. "I think we need to go to the police," I said, my voice trembling. "This is getting out of hand." But Greg hesitated. What if it's just some crazy prankster, someone with too much time on their hands? Before I could answer, the phone rang again. I looked at Greg, my eyes wide with fear. "It's them." He stood up and grabbed the phone. "I'll handle this." I watched him answer, but what happened next made my blood run cold. The voice on the other end wasn't speaking to him, it was speaking to me. "I'm still watching," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. "You think you're safe, don't you? You think you're protected. But I know everything, down to the smallest detail." I grabbed the phone from Greg, my hands shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" I yelled into the phone. The voice laughed, low and sinister. "I want you to know that I am everywhere. I know your every move. And soon, you'll know exactly why." The line went dead. The calls didn't stop, but they grew increasingly erratic, the voice now taunting me, as if playing some sick game. It was clear that this person was not just watching us, they were stalking us, planning something, but what? We went to the police, and they ran an investigation, but they couldn't trace the calls. The unknown number seemed to disappear each time they tried. No fingerprints, no leads, nothing. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. But one night, as I was sitting in my kitchen going over the calls in my head, it finally hit me. The key to everything. I remembered something strange from one of the calls. The voice had said something, almost in passing, about the wallpaper in our living room, how it was faded in places and looked different from the last time they saw it. No one but us knew about the wallpaper, and I hadn't told a soul about it. The realization struck like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just a random stalker. It was someone who had been inside our home. We moved. It was the only option left, but even after we left our old house behind, the terror followed. The stalker never stopped calling. The phone calls, though less frequent, still came. The voice would never stop haunting us. And every time I pick up the phone, I'm left wondering, who really knew everything about us? How far does the nightmare go? And more chilling still, who's out there, still watching? It was a typical Friday night, or so I thought. I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when the phone rang. I wasn't babysitting that evening, but I had taken the usual gig the past few weekends for a family in the neighborhood. This was my night off, so I had no reason to pick up the phone. But I did anyway, out of habit. "Hello?" I answered, trying to hide the yawn creeping up my throat. "Have you checked on the kids yet?" The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an undertone of urgency that set my nerves on edge. I froze, sitting up straight. That was odd. The parents had always been straightforward, and I knew they wouldn't call this early to check on the kids. They usually texted, and I had already received their confirmation earlier that evening. I wasn't babysitting tonight. "I'm sorry, who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, followed by a chuckle that seemed to come from the other end of a long, dark tunnel. "Just wondering if you've checked on the kids yet." My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. Maybe it was just a wrong number, but the voice, it sounded familiar. It was almost too familiar. "I'm not babysitting tonight," I said, my voice faltering, doubt creeping in. "I'm not even watching the kids." There was a brief silence before the voice responded again, but this time with a touch of amusement. "Are you sure?" I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong. My gut told me to hang up, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to listen, to understand what was going on. Before I could speak again, the line went dead. I stared at my phone for a moment, the eerie silence of the house surrounding me. Why would someone ask if I was checking on kids I wasn't even supposed to be watching? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some prank. I'd been pranked before. It was nothing. But that nagging feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts. But just as I started to relax, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be the same unknown number. It wasn't. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize, but it seemed too coincidental to ignore. I answered it immediately. "Hello? Have you checked on the kids yet?" The same voice, the same calm tone. My heart skipped a beat. I looked down at my phone. It was a different number. But the voice, the words, everything felt like déjà vu. My hands shook as I held the phone to my ear. "What do you mean?" "I'm not babysitting tonight." "Are you sure?" The voice was almost mocking now. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Stop calling me. I'm not babysitting. You've got the wrong person." My voice wavered, fear creeping in. This time, the line didn't go dead immediately. I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate on the other end. But no response. I hung up, heart pounding. I stood up, pacing around the living room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Was it just a prank? I tried to convince myself it was, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the minutes ticked by, my phone remained silent. For a while, I sat there, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the silence in the house only made my paranoia grow. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but just as I did, a third call came through. I stared at the screen for a second before answering. "Have you checked on the kids yet?" My breath caught in my throat. "No," I whispered, the reality hitting me all at once. "I'm not babysitting. I'm not even supposed to be watching anyone tonight. This isn't funny anymore." The voice didn't reply. But in the background, I thought I heard something. A sound I couldn't quite place. A muffled thump. A soft scrape. I immediately ended the call, my heart thundering in my chest. What was that noise? I rushed to the front door, the panic setting in. Maybe the caller was outside playing some twisted game. Maybe they were watching me. The idea of someone being so close, someone who knew things about me, things no stranger should, made my stomach turn. I grabbed my jacket, my hands trembling, but before I could open the door, my phone rang again. I hesitated, my eyes scanning the dark room. This had to end. It had to. I reluctantly answered. "Have you checked on the kids yet?" My breath caught in my throat. "I'm not babysitting tonight." I screamed into the phone. My voice cracked, barely audible. For the first time, the voice on the other end didn't sound calm. It was a whisper, barely audible, but I could hear it clearly. "But we never said you were." The words hit me like a slap. I felt the color drain from my face as everything clicked into place. The phone calls, the insistence, the questions about children I wasn't watching. None of it made sense until now. I wasn't the babysitter tonight, but someone else was. I backed away from the door, my legs weak. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. What did that mean? Who had called me, and why? And who was really watching the children? Was I being watched? I felt like I was losing control, like my world was slipping away. My pulse raced, and I could hardly breathe. Was someone in my house? Was I being tricked into thinking I wasn't babysitting? The phone rang again. I didn't want to answer. I didn't even want to know. But my fingers moved on their own, and I picked up. "Hello? Have you checked on the kids yet?" the voice said, calm and steady as ever. The room spun around me, and everything inside me screamed to run. But my feet wouldn't move. The voice was too familiar now. It had been here before. It knew things it shouldn't. I hung up without another word. I didn't know what to do next. Who was behind this? How had they known who I was? Why was I the one getting these calls? I couldn't make sense of it. The fear grew in my chest, suffocating me, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I dropped my phone on the couch and rushed to the door again. This time, I wasn't thinking. I just needed to get out. I needed to find out what was happening, what this was all about. But as I opened the door, the sight before me made my blood run cold. The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across the steps, and there, standing just outside the doorway, was a figure. Not a person I recognized, but someone who seemed to be waiting for me. And behind them, a set of children, staring at me. The chilling realization hit me hard. The voice wasn't a wrong number. It wasn't a prank. I wasn't the babysitter, but I was the one who had been called to watch. The figure on the porch raised a hand, and with it, they gestured for me to come closer. The children watched, their eyes empty. And as I stood frozen, I realized that it wasn't a mistake after all. I was the one who was supposed to be there. But I wasn't. And that was the worst mistake I could have made. When I was 10, my Aunt Margaret sent me a doll for my birthday. It was porcelain, delicate, with painted blue eyes that seemed far too real for comfort. It wore a Victorian-style dress, its lacy edges meticulously stitched. It wasn't my style. I preferred action figures and books, but I thanked her with a smile, as kids are taught to do. Looking back, I should have known something was wrong. The first time I noticed the doll had moved, I blamed myself. It sat on the shelf in my room, untouched, gathering dust. I vividly remember placing it there after unwrapping it, but one morning it was sitting on my desk. "Mom, did you touch my doll?" I asked over breakfast, half hoping she'd laugh and admit to some prank. She barely looked up from her coffee. "No, honey." "Why?" I didn't push the topic. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. A week later, I shoved the doll into the back of my closet. Out of sight, out of mind. I was sure I'd wake up and find it sitting on my nightstand. My friends had teased me when they saw it, calling it creepy, and I couldn't help but agree. But the next morning, there it was. Perched on my bookshelf, its painted eyes staring blankly into the room. My heart raced. How did it get there? I hadn't touched it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Its face was as lifeless as ever, but the weight of its gaze felt suffocating. Shaking off the dread, I hid it under my bed this time, wedged in a shoebox. That night I dreamt of footsteps, tiny, deliberate, pacing the length of my room. I woke in a cold sweat, my gaze darting immediately to the shelf. The doll wasn't there. Instead, it was sitting in my desk chair. "Mom," I screamed. She rushed in, panicked. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the doll, too afraid to touch it. "It keeps moving." Mom gave me that look parents reserve for overactive imaginations. "Honey, it's just a doll. Maybe you're moving it and forgetting." "I'm not." But she didn't believe me. No one did. Determined to prove I wasn't crazy, I set a trap. That night, I locked the doll in an old storage trunk in the attic. I placed a heavy box on top for good measure. Satisfied, I went to bed, confident the nightmare would end. Morning came, and the doll was sitting on my pillow. After that, I stopped trying to hide it. Wherever I placed the doll, it would inevitably find its way back into my room. Sometimes it would be on the windowsill, other times in the corner, always watching. And then, the whispers began. At first I thought it was the wind. Soft, incomprehensible murmurs drifted through the night, barely audible. But the closer I listened, the clearer they became. "Stay with me." The voice was faint, childlike, but undeniably there. It felt as if someone was speaking directly into my ear, even though I was alone. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Don't leave me." Desperate for answers, I decided to confront Aunt Margaret. I called her, hesitant to bring up the doll, but knowing I couldn't avoid it. "Aunt Margaret," I began, my voice shaky, "where did you get that doll you sent me?" She paused for a long time. "Why do you ask?" "It's been acting weird." Her laughter was strained. "It's just a doll, sweetie." "No, it's not," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "It moves. It whispers to me. Please, just tell me where you got it." Her tone shifted, colder now. "I think it's best if you get rid of it." Click. She hung up. I decided to destroy the doll. If no one believed me, I'd handle it myself. That night, I took it outside to the backyard fire pit. The air was crisp, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. I poured lighter fluid over the doll, my hands trembling, and struck a match. But as the flame caught, the whispers erupted into screams. "No, don't! The doll's porcelain face cracked, its painted eyes melting into black pools. The fire blazed higher than it should have, an unnatural heat forcing me to step back. And then it was over. The flames died, leaving behind only ash. I should have felt relief, but unease lingered. The house felt different, heavier. Shadows seemed darker, corners colder. A week later, I found a piece of the doll, a tiny charred hand, sitting on my pillow. The whispers returned that night. I woke up to an odd silence. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but then it hit me. The world around me was eerily still. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant car engines, not even the usual chirping of birds outside my window. I could feel my pulse quicken as I sat up in bed, looking around my small apartment. The air seemed thicker, somehow heavier, as though the whole world had been drained of life. I rubbed my eyes, half expecting the silence to end, for it to break into the usual chaos of morning. Cars honking outside, the whir of the coffee maker, the blare of music from the apartment next door. But nothing. No noise, no signs of life. I pulled myself out of bed, my feet landing heavily on the cold floor. A shiver ran down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice felt small in the vast emptiness of the apartment. I wasn't sure why I expected an answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I walked through the apartment, checking the rooms one by one. The kitchen was empty, the bathroom untouched, the bedroom still in its usual disarray. The place was exactly as I'd left it, but something felt off, like I was in the wrong place, or perhaps in the wrong time. I grabbed my phone, hoping for some sign that the world hadn't simply vanished. No new messages, no missed calls, no notifications at all. I dialed the number of my best friend just to hear a voice. It rang once, twice, then the call disconnected. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Maybe the signal was down? But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. There had been no warning, no disaster, no sign of an impending catastrophe. It was as if everything had just stopped. I stepped out onto the balcony, hoping for some hint of what was happening outside. The city spread out before me, silent and lifeless. Cars sat abandoned on the streets, their windows fogged over. Not a single person was in sight. I felt the weight of the isolation press down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. How could this be? Where was everyone? Panic began to rise in my chest as I stared at the empty streets. I started to move, half walking, half running down the stairs of my building, desperate for answers. When I reached the bottom floor, I pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cold morning air. My breath fogged in front of me as I looked around. There was no one. No cars driving, no pedestrians walking, not even a stray animal in sight. It was as if the entire city had been abandoned, or perhaps wiped clean. I walked for what felt like hours, through deserted streets and down empty alleys. My footsteps echoed in the silence, a constant reminder that I was utterly alone. I knocked on the doors of my neighbors, but no one answered. I checked every store, every cafe, every office building. The world had been emptied of life. I even went to the park, hoping to find someone, anyone. Nothing. It was as if everyone had just vanished into thin air. By the time I returned to my apartment, exhaustion weighed heavily on my shoulders. I collapsed onto the couch, my head spinning with a million thoughts. What had happened? Why was I the only one left? Am I the last human alive? I tried to distract myself with television, but every channel was static. I flicked through news websites, but there were no new updates, no explanations, just more silence. It was then that I heard it. A knock. It came from the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the door. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the sound? I waited, but there it was again. A knock. Light, but insistent. I stood up, my legs shaky, and approached the door slowly, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air in the apartment had thickened again, the silence heavier than before. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned the knob and opened the door. Nothing. I stepped outside, scanning the hallway. The apartment building was just as empty as it had been before. No one. The silence was almost deafening now, pressing in on me from all sides. But then, just as I was about to close the door, I heard it again. A faint whisper, as if someone were standing right behind me. Hello? I whipped around, but there was no one there. My skin crawled as the whisper seemed to hang in the air like an echo from another time. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, frozen in place. The voice was so soft, so gentle, but it felt like it was pulling me deeper into some terrible unknown. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling, but no answer came. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my mind reeling. The knock, the whisper, I was alone, weren't I? I stumbled back to my couch, my mind racing. Maybe it was just my fear playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just so desperate to hear another voice, I had imagined it. But no, I could still feel it, the presence. Someone, or something, was out there. I wasn't as alone as I thought. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the soft whisper, almost like a beckoning. "Come. Find me." I couldn't move. I wanted to, but my body refused. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my arms heavy and numb. The silence in the apartment had thickened, the air now suffocating. Every sound felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the blinds echoing in my ears. Then, a shadow. A figure standing just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring at the door, unable to look away. Whoever it was, they didn't knock again. Instead, they stood there, silent, as if waiting for me to do something. I forced myself to move, my hand reaching for the doorknob again, my fingers cold and clammy. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. It had to be a trick of the mind. But when I opened the door, there was nothing there, only the empty hallway, only the oppressive silence. I stared into the void beyond, hoping that somehow I would find the answers. That maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. That I wasn't the last one, that this wasn't happening. But the knock came again, and this time I couldn't ignore it. The whisper started to grow louder, each syllable a soft, haunting caress in the air. "You're not alone." My heart raced as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. Was it a person? A trick of the light? Was I losing my sanity? But then I heard the voice again, unmistakable, clear as day. "You're not alone." I turned and fled down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder and louder. I couldn't stop myself. I had to get away. I couldn't be the only one. Not like this. As I ran, I could hear the knock follow me. And then, the whisper, just a breath away from my ear. "You're not alone." And in that moment, I knew it was true. The world had changed, but I wasn't the last one. Not anymore. It was a cool fall evening, the kind where the air feels crisp against your skin, and the scent of earth and decaying leaves fills your lungs. I had just finished work at the diner, and the streets were empty as usual. The town had always been quiet, almost too quiet, with its dilapidated houses and overgrown lawns. I didn't mind the peace. It was soothing, like the world had forgotten about us. That night, however, something caught my eye. Walking home, I glanced over to the old house at the end of the block, a place that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The windows were broken, and ivy crept up the sides of the walls like a twisted hand. It had always been an unsettling house, but tonight something was different. A flicker of light appeared in the upstairs window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of a streetlight, but no, the light was a soft glow, almost like a candle's flame. It was faint but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. The house had been abandoned for years. Who would be lighting a candle in there? And why at midnight? I stood there for a moment, transfixed by the sight. The glow was mesmerizing, hypnotic even. I could feel an unease creep up my spine, but my curiosity won over. It was too strange, too inexplicable. Something about it felt like it was calling me. Over the next few nights, the candle would appear at exactly midnight. And each time, I couldn't help but watch. It became an obsession. The soft glow would flicker, almost as if it were teasing me, daring me to investigate. I wasn't the only one who noticed either. A few of the neighbors mentioned it too, though none of them dared to go near the house. They spoke of it in hushed tones, as if afraid to even acknowledge its existence. "What do you think it is?" I asked Tim, a regular at the diner. He leaned over the counter, glancing nervously at the window. "No idea," he muttered. "Maybe it's just some kids messing around." But I knew it wasn't. There was something far more unsettling about it. The way the light never seemed to waver, how it appeared every single night like clockwork. It didn't feel natural. I started to wonder what could be causing it. Maybe someone had broken into the house, made a campfire, or perhaps it was a strange, forgotten ritual from the past. But then, something else occurred to me. What if it wasn't a person at all? What if it was something else? That night, I decided I was going to find out. I had no plan, no preparation, just a wild curiosity that burned within me. As midnight approached, I found myself standing in front of the house, the eerie candlelight shining from the second-floor window. My heartbeat was loud in my ears as I stared up at the dark silhouette of the house. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I pushed open the rusted gate and walked slowly toward the front door. My footsteps echoed in the still night air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like I was being watched, like the house itself was alive and waiting for me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was greeted with a stale, musty air. The house had been abandoned for so long that dust had settled over everything. The wooden floorboards groaned under my weight, and I had to fight the urge to turn around and run. The candle, which had been burning brightly from the upstairs window, was now just a faint glow at the end of the hallway. It beckoned me forward. I climbed the stairs cautiously, the old wood beneath my feet creaking with every step. The silence was deafening. It felt like the whole house was holding its breath. And then I reached the room. The room was dark, save for the faint light from the candle. It was perched on an old wooden table in the center of the room, flickering slightly, as though it were responding to the wind. But there was no wind. The air inside the house was thick and heavy. I took a step forward, my breath caught in my throat. As I crossed the threshold into the room, something strange happened. The candle, this mysterious, constant flame that had burned every night for who knows how long, extinguished. I froze. My eyes darted to the wick, expecting it to reignite, but it remained dark. A cold chill swept through the room, and a feeling of dread settled over me like a heavy cloak. I tried to make sense of it, but there was nothing to explain it. No breeze, no logical reason why the candle would go out. And yet, it had. I took a hesitant step back, my mind racing. What was I missing? Suddenly, I heard it. A faint whisper, so quiet that I almost thought it was my imagination, coming from somewhere behind me. It was a sound like the wind, but wrong. It was more like a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Leave. The word was barely audible, but it chilled me to the bone. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the dust and the silence. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. I turned and ran, my footsteps heavy and panicked as I stumbled back down the stairs. The door slammed behind me with a deafening bang, and I didn't stop running until I was safely back home. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. The candle had been out when I left the house, but it had been burning when I first approached. Something about that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just an old house, it was something more. I spent the next few days trying to learn more about the house's history. It wasn't difficult to find out that it had once belonged to an old widow, Mrs. Montgomery, who had lived there alone for years. She was well known around town, but no one spoke much of her after she passed away, and the house was left to rot. But then I found something odd, a newspaper article buried in the archives of the town library. It told the story of Mrs. Montgomery's mysterious death. She had been found in her bed, but there were no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. Just gone. The article mentioned that, before her death, she had been seen lighting candles in the windows every night at midnight. It was said that she believed the house was haunted by the spirits of her ancestors, and she lit the candles to guide them. But one line in the article stood out. The last candle she lit before her death was never extinguished, even after the house was abandoned. I returned to the house the following night, unsure of what I hoped to find. The candle was there again, glowing brightly in the window, just like before. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the house once more. I wasn't sure if I could face it again, but I had to know the truth. I entered the house one last time, but this time the candle didn't go out. Instead, it flickered wildly, as though it were being blown by an unseen wind, and then I saw her. Mrs. Montgomery stood in the corner of the room, her figure pale and transparent. Her eyes were dark, like deep pools of shadow. She didn't speak, but I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Her lips moved and the whisper returned. "You shouldn't have come." Before I could react, the candle went out and the room plunged into darkness. The house felt alive, the walls closing in, the air thick with the scent of decay. The last thing I remember before I ran screaming from the house was her cold, lifeless hand reaching for me. I never went back after that night. But every midnight, without fail, the candle lights up in that abandoned house. And I can't help but wonder if Mrs. Montgomery is still waiting for someone, anyone, to come and join her. It started innocently enough. One lazy Saturday afternoon, wandering through the crowded aisles of a local flea market. The air smelled of roasted peanuts and old books, the perfect mix of nostalgia and comfort. My best friend Sarah had dragged me there, claiming she needed something vintage for her new apartment. I had no intention of buying anything. But then, I saw it. Nestled between a rusted birdcage and a stack of faded vinyl records was a mirror. It wasn't just any mirror. It was exquisite. The oval frame was carved from dark wood, adorned with ornate floral patterns that curled like ivy. The glass itself seemed untouched by time, clear and almost too reflective, as if it was inviting me to step closer. "How much?" I asked the vendor, an older man with leathery skin and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "For you, $50. Sarah rolled her eyes. "You don't need a mirror, Claire. Especially not a creepy one like that." But I couldn't walk away. Something about it drew me in. It felt alive. The mirror found a place of honor in my bedroom, propped against the wall opposite my bed. It didn't match my modern decor, but I didn't care. It made the room feel different, more sophisticated, almost magical. The first night, I noticed it. I was brushing my hair, getting ready for bed, when I saw something strange. My reflection didn't mimic my movements. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but when I tilted my head, the reflection paused a fraction of a second too long before following. I laughed it off, blaming the dim lighting. Maybe I was tired, but over the next few days it became harder to ignore. One morning, as I leaned into the mirror to apply mascara, I caught a flicker of movement. Not mine, hers. My reflection smiled before I did. It wasn't a normal smile either. It was sly, as if it knew something I didn't. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair behind me. "Claire, get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. But no amount of rationalizing could explain what happened next. Late one night, I woke to a faint sound, like fingernails tapping against glass. My heart thudded as I scanned the room. The mirror glimmered faintly in the moonlight, its surface rippling as if it were water. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost inaudible, but it was coming from the mirror. I froze, clutching the blanket to my chest. My reflection was there, but it wasn't me. Her eyes, my eyes, were wide with fear. Her hands pressed against the inside of the glass, palms flat as though she were trapped. "Let me out," she whispered. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. My throat felt tight, like invisible hands were choking me. What do you want?" I managed to croak. Her expression softened, but it wasn't comforting. It was manipulative, like she was trying to coax a frightened animal. "We belong together," she said. "Just one step and everything will be fine." From that night on, the mirror consumed me. Every time I looked into it, she was there, watching, mimicking, waiting. Sometimes she would press her face against the glass, her features distorted like a funhouse reflection. Other times, she'd simply stand still while I moved, her eyes following me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I stopped sleeping. I draped a sheet over the mirror, but it didn't help. I'd still hear her voice at night, whispering my name, begging me to uncover the glass. "Why won't you help me, Claire?" I tried to get rid of it. I hauled the mirror down to the dumpster, but by the time I returned to my apartment, it was back, propped against the wall as if it had never left. Desperate, I searched for answers. I scoured the internet, looking for anything about haunted mirrors or strange reflections. Most of it was garbage, urban legends and ghost stories. But then I found a forum dedicated to paranormal artifacts. One user's story stood out. She described a mirror just like mine, an antique with intricate carvings, a reflection that moved independently. Her post ended ominously. If it tries to step out, don't let it, no matter what. The thought made me sick. Could that happen? Could it escape? A week later, the mirror's patience ran out. I was lying in bed, the sheet still draped over the glass, when I heard a loud crack. It sounded like ice shattering, sharp and violent. I turned on the light. The sheet had fallen to the floor, and the mirror was splintered, but not broken. The cracks spiderwebbed across the glass, distorting my reflection. But she was still there, smiling, triumphant. "It's time," she said. The glass began to ripple, the cracks glowing faintly. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hand pressed against the surface, and this time it didn't stop. Her fingers broke through, pale and cold, gripping the frame. I screamed, grabbing the closest thing I could find, a heavy book, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crash. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was in pieces. My reflection was gone, replaced by jagged shards that reflected my terrified face 100 times over. I thought it was over. I wanted to believe it was over, but the whispers haven't stopped. Sometimes when I walk past shop windows or glance at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I see her. Not fully, just a flicker, a smirk, a shadow. She's still there waiting, and I know one day she'll find a way back. It started with the meteor shower. I remember standing outside on my porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the night sky erupt into streaks of fire. The meteor shower had been hyped up for weeks, a once-in-a-lifetime event, the news anchors kept saying. I didn't want to miss it. The show began around 9 p.m., and by midnight the sky looked like it was being torn apart by fiery blades. It was stunning, surreal, almost magical. But as the streaks of light faded into the horizon, a peculiar unease settled over me. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. My head throbbed with a dull ache, but I brushed it off as sleep deprivation. If only I'd known that night was the beginning of something far darker. I woke up late the next day, my curtains still drawn tight. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. At first, I ignored them, stumbling into the bathroom to splash water on my face. As I leaned over the sink, my reflection in the mirror caught my attention. Something was off. I moved my hand to touch my face, and my reflection mirrored me, as it should. But there was something unsettling about the way it moved, delayed, almost hesitant. I blinked, and it blinked a fraction of a second later. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to exhaustion. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. As I turned away, though, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. My reflection hadn't turned with me. It was still staring straight ahead, its lips curling into a faint smirk. Throughout the day, strange news reports started popping up online. Social media was flooded with videos and posts about defiant reflections. A woman claimed her reflection didn't mimic her actions and instead glared at her, slamming its fists against the glass. A man posted a blurry video of his reflection, grinning menacingly while he stared in frozen terror. I wanted to dismiss it all as a hoax, but my own experience that morning had left a sour taste in my mouth. I avoided mirrors for the rest of the day, refusing to even glance at the glossy surfaces of my appliances. By nightfall, the fear was tangible. Friends texted me about their own encounters. Mirrors cracking under pressure, reflections behaving as if they were alive. "It's the meteor shower," one text read. "Something fell from the sky last night. This isn't normal." It was around 2 a.m. when it happened to me. I was in my living room, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, trying to drown out the anxiety bubbling inside me. The only light in the room came from the dim glow of my TV. I noticed movement in the reflection on the dark screen. I froze. It was me, but not me. My reflection sat there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to pulse with their own light. Slowly, it tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. My stomach churned as its lips parted into a toothy grin, far wider than any human smile should be. "Why do you look so scared?" it whispered. I screamed, stumbling backward, my phone clattering to the floor. The reflection moved, its hands pressing against the screen as if it could push through. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. Then a faint knocking sound echoed from the bathroom mirror. "Let me out," it hissed. By morning, the world had changed. Reports of reflections breaking free of their confines filled every news channel. Cities were in chaos as these rogue doubles wreaked havoc, assaulting their counterparts, destroying property, even committing murders. I stayed holed up in my apartment, every reflective surface covered with blankets or towels. My laptop screen sat closed on the table, my phone face down. But even without mirrors, I could feel it. My reflection, or whatever it had become, was still out there, waiting. When night fell again, the air outside was filled with screams and distant crashes. My building felt eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. I didn't dare sleep. At some point in the early hours, I heard it, a faint scratching at my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I slowly approached, careful not to make a sound. There, outside the glass, was my reflection. Its features were warped, twisted, but undeniably mine. It pressed its palms against the window, staring at me with hollow eyes. "Let me in," it mouthed. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. The reflection's face contorted with rage. It slammed its fists against the glass, over and over, until cracks began to spread like spider webs. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the window, retreating to the corner of the room. The pounding continued, relentless and deafening. Then suddenly, it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, clutching a baseball bat I'd found in my closet. When I finally summoned the courage to peek outside, the reflection was gone, but the cracks in the glass remained, proof that it had been real. Weeks have passed since that night, and the world hasn't recovered. Reflections are no longer safe. People cover mirrors or avoid them entirely, but it doesn't always work. Sometimes I catch glimpses of it, in puddles, in darkened windows, even in the eyes of strangers. It's always watching, waiting for its chance. And I know, deep down, that it won't stop until it's taken my place. The worst part? Sometimes when I'm too tired to fight, I wonder if maybe it already has. I remember the first time I noticed something unusual. I'd lived in the town all my life, and the cemetery was nothing more than a place for the occasional walk or to pay respects to loved ones. The graveyard itself was tucked away on the edge of town, bordered by thick trees and an old stone wall. It had always felt like the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary could happen. A place that didn't really fit into our bustling community of small-town life. But that was before the gravestones started changing. At first, it was just small, subtle shifts. I'd walked past it a dozen times before, a simple stone with an inscription that seemed ordinary enough. Except it wasn't. The first time I saw it was late one autumn afternoon, just before dusk. I was cutting through the cemetery, taking my usual shortcut home, when I noticed that something seemed off about that particular grave. The name etched into the stone was faintly visible, but it wasn't one I recognized. "Who's that?" I muttered to myself, squinting at the stone. The name wasn't one from any of the families in the town. I shrugged it off. It wasn't entirely uncommon for newer stones to crop up, though this one seemed a little out of place. It was plain, simple, almost too neat. It had no flowers or any other markings around it, unlike most of the other graves that had some kind of decoration or memento. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange shiver, like someone was watching me from the shadows. But when I glanced over my shoulder, no one was there. It didn't hit me at first, but the following day, I noticed the same stone. This time, the inscription had changed. It was subtle. So subtle, in fact, that I almost thought I'd imagined it. The name that had been there the day before was gone, replaced by one that seemed familiar, but not quite right. I stood there for a moment, trying to place it. "Isn't that the name of Mrs. Pritchard's late husband?" I murmured. Mrs. Pritchard lived 2 streets over, a kindly old woman who always waved to me when I passed by. But her husband had passed away years ago. I checked the date on the gravestone, and sure enough, the dates matched up. That's when I felt it, a cold knot of unease in my stomach. Why would someone change the inscription? Over the following weeks, I noticed the same thing happening again and again. Each time I walked by, the name on that gravestone had shifted, changed, rearranged itself into different names. Names I recognized but couldn't quite place. Old friends, family members of people in town, some I hadn't thought about in years. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the more I saw, the harder it became to brush off. Then, one fateful night, everything changed. I had just finished a long shift at the diner and was walking home when I decided to take my usual shortcut through the cemetery. The sun had set and the air was thick with fog. The night was quiet, eerily so, but that wasn't what sent a chill down my spine. As I walked past the gravestone, I saw it again, the inscription. But this time, it wasn't someone from the past. The name etched into the stone was mine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing in my chest. The name on the gravestone wasn't the one I had seen earlier. It was my own. That's impossible, I whispered to myself, my mind racing. But there it was, as clear as day. Jonathan Gray, born 1989, died 2024. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I stared at it, unable to tear my eyes away, wondering if I was hallucinating. But no, this was real. This was my name. My date of death, written in blackened stone. My entire body went cold. The fog seemed to press in closer around me, and I could hear nothing but my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I didn't know what to think. Was it a prank? A sick joke from someone in town who knew I'd been walking by the cemetery? But no, this felt different. This wasn't some practical joke. It felt wrong. I sprinted home that night, my mind never leaving the image of the gravestone. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. What kind of twisted game was this? Who could possibly have done something like that? And why? The next day I returned, determined to get to the bottom of it. But when I reached the cemetery, something else happened. Something that made my blood run cold. The gravestone had changed again. This time it was back to a name I didn't recognize. There was no trace of my own name. I felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. Something deep in my gut told me that I hadn't seen the last of it. Days passed, but every time I went back to the cemetery, the gravestone changed. Sometimes it was the name of someone who had passed away long ago. Other times it was someone who was still alive. The names seemed to come and go, shifting and changing, like a cursed puzzle I couldn't solve. But one thing became clear to me over time. The gravestone had a purpose. It was trying to tell me something, or perhaps warn me. I'd seen enough now to know that it wasn't just a coincidence. This gravestone was connected to something darker, something sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was using that gravestone to keep track of the people in town, to mark the lives of those who would soon be gone, and worse, that I might be next. The final piece of the puzzle came one fateful evening. I was sitting in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee, when I overheard a conversation between two old men. They were talking about the cemetery, as they often did. "It's been like this for years, hasn't it?" one of them asked. "Too long," the other replied, "but it never changes. Not for good. Not until it's time." "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's your turn," the first man muttered. "The gravestone will tell you. It tells you when your time's up." I froze, every nerve in my body tingling. My mind reeled. Was this connected to the gravestone? Had these men seen it too? And if so, what did they mean by your turn? I left the diner in a daze, racing back to the cemetery, praying that I was wrong. But as I reached the gravestone, I knew the truth. The stone had changed again. This time it was my name, etched in cold hard stone, with the date, 2024, looming ominously over me. My heart sank. The game was up. I had no idea what it meant or why this was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. My time was coming. The gravestone had marked me. It was no longer a joke, no longer just a mystery. The stone was keeping track of who would soon vanish, and it was clear that I wasn't going to escape whatever dark force was behind it. I don't know what will happen to me next. I don't know if I'll wake up tomorrow, or if I'll vanish into the night, my name fading from the gravestone like all the others. But I can't shake the feeling that, in some way, this was never just about a gravestone. It was about something far worse, a dark, unshakable fate that no one could escape. And soon, I would find out if I could outrun it. But for now, all I can do is wait. Wait and pray that this is just a nightmare I'll wake up from, because if it's not, then I don't have much time left. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter for our family. My husband, Luke and I had spent years saving up for the perfect house, and when we found it, a spacious, beautiful home nestled on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, we knew we had to have it. It had everything: large rooms, a cozy fireplace, a backyard perfect for our 2 kids, and a picturesque view of the woods behind the house. It was perfect. We moved in excitedly, starting the long process of making the house our own. But something changed after the first few nights. At first, it was little things. The creak of the floorboards at odd hours, a cold breeze that would drift through the house even when all the windows were shut tight. Then, one morning, I found a letter slipped under the front door. It wasn't addressed to anyone. No name. Just a cryptic message. "I've been watching you. I've watched this house for decades." I chalked it up to a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors was trying to get a rise out of us. I showed Luke the letter, and we both had a good laugh. But as the days went by, more letters started showing up, each more disturbing than the last. They weren't signed. There was only one name that kept appearing: the Watcher. The second letter arrived a few days after the first. This time, it was slid through the mail slot. I almost didn't open it, but something in me told me I had to. "I know what you did to the basement. The old wallpaper is gone now, but I remember when it was still there. Do you? I remember how it used to smell in the summer when the windows were closed." My stomach churned. We hadn't done anything to the basement. We'd only been in the house for a week, and I had no idea what the letter was referring to. Luke was busy at work, and the kids were out at their grandmother's house for the weekend. I took a deep breath and walked down to the basement. The air was heavy, musty, and stale. I could feel the weight of the walls pressing in on me. I stood there for a moment, just listening, as though expecting to hear something, anything, that would make sense of the letter. But there was nothing. I went back upstairs, feeling an unease that settled deep into my bones. I showed Luke the letter when he came home, and he agreed that it was strange but told me not to overreact. "Probably just someone messing with us," he said, trying to ease my anxiety. But the next letter arrived just a few days later, and it was even more unsettling. "You haven't noticed, have you? The way the lights flicker at night? It's because I'm watching you. Every movement you make, every room you enter, I see it all." I could barely breathe as I read the words. How could they know this? We hadn't mentioned anything to anyone. I turned to Luke, my heart racing, but he didn't seem to share my panic. He just brushed it off, telling me that it was probably someone who knew about the house's history, maybe an old tenant or someone with a sick sense of humor. But the letters kept coming. Every few days, another one would appear. They were always unsettling and felt like they were getting closer to home, closer to us. The Watcher seemed to know details about the house, about our routine, about things we hadn't even told our closest friends. And it didn't stop with just the letters. One night, while I was cleaning up after dinner, I felt a strange sensation. A prickling on the back of my neck, as though someone was watching me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The kids were upstairs playing, and Luke was on the couch, lost in a football game. I dismissed it as nothing, but as I walked toward the window, I froze. Outside, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. A man. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see his silhouette. A tall, thin shape standing still, as though he were waiting for something. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at him, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. I didn't tell Luke about the man. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I decided to do some research on the house. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who had lived there for over 30 years before passing away, but there were no details about their family or anyone who might have had a connection to the house. No one had mentioned any disturbances, and yet this Watcher seemed to know everything about us. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The letters continued, and they became increasingly personal. One even mentioned the kids by name, telling me how beautiful they were and how he had watched them play in the backyard. He wrote about my husband's habits, the way he always left his shoes by the door, how I liked to keep the blinds half drawn in the mornings. "I've seen your life, your every move. I'll be watching you always. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. One night, after I had received yet another letter, I decided I had had enough. I called the police and told them everything. The letters, the strange figure in the yard, the feeling of being watched. They came over the next day, but of course, they found nothing. No fingerprints, no clues, no trace of the watcher. The house was quiet, peaceful even, as if nothing had ever happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, filled with paranoia and dread. I kept imagining someone lurking outside, watching us through the windows. I pulled the curtains closed, but it didn't help. I could still feel the eyes on me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft noise from downstairs. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was a faint, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I got out of bed quietly, my heart in my throat, and tiptoed down the hallway. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. There, at the bottom of the staircase, was another letter. It was sitting on the floor, waiting for me. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and opened it with shaking fingers. The words inside made my blood run cold. You thought you could leave, but you're not going anywhere. I'm always watching. I turned to look down the hall, my pulse racing. It was like I was living in a nightmare, trapped in a house that was slowly becoming my prison. I had no idea who the Watcher was, or why they were doing this to us, but I knew one thing. We weren't safe. In the days that followed, the Watcher's presence seemed to linger. No matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every corner of the house felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. Luke was starting to notice too. The tension between us grew. The kids were scared, asking me questions I didn't have answers to. Why did the lights flicker? Why did it always feel like someone was watching them? I had no explanation. And then, one evening, I received the final letter. This one was different. I know what you're planning. Don't bother leaving. I'll be waiting. I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer. The Watcher had turned our dream home into a nightmare. We left the house that night. We didn't even pack. We just walked away, leaving everything behind. As I looked back at the house from the car window, I couldn't help but wonder if the Watcher had been right all along. Had he always been there, watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows? I'll never know. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the Watcher.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.